Hey everyone, it's been a little while since I've checked in. I hope that you're doing well. I hope that the catch up week last week was helpful in some way, shape, or form for you. Please do reach out if you have any questions, concerns, you could use help with anything. I did want to point out, because I've had a couple of questions about this, just in terms of the overall structure of how the work in each unit goes. Do remember that the reading responses are meant to be kind of short overview little notes about your reading. So you want to be broad in those. You want to touch on a bunch of different topics, but in just a little bit of depth. Still in the context of the guiding question. Everything that we do is in the context of that question. But those are meant to be less detailed than the journal entry for sure, but also less detailed than the timeline assignment work. So again, try to cover a few different points, different events, different issues from across the readings assigned for the unit in those reading responses. I think that was a little more apparent or intuitive, I guess I should say, when I had assigned that assignment just on Twitter rather than with the option to do that on the discussion board. So I just wanted to point that out so that you're not trying to write a ton. It's meant to sort of build, with the journal entry being the culmination of the work that we're doing for the unit, where you reflect on everything that you learned, you reflect on which sources and readings meant the most to you and helped you in the most specific ways to answer that unit's guiding question. So I hope that that's helpful. Also, I wanted to just touch base to see if anyone is interested in doing a live Zoom type of meeting. It, of course, would be optional. It would be for extra credit. You could, I'll record it so that you could watch it after the fact and send me a little response to get some extra credit as well, so that people who couldn't be there could also have that opportunity. But I had the chance to drop in a colleague's class the other day to talk about some research I've done on Columbus, New Mexico, and Pancho Villa's raid, and it made me think maybe that would be a good thing to do here. So we could talk about Columbus, we could talk about Guatemala. So the topics that are coming up in our course have to do with nationalism, with self-determination, with political and social revolution, and also reaction to that. So we're going to study the military dictatorships that developed in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, often with U.S. support. So those are things that are up and coming, things that we could talk about in some detail in a meeting like that. And so if that's something that is interesting to you, please respond in the activity feed below. So remember, that's at the bottom of the page, the course homepage. I'll put a little prompt there asking essentially that same question. Let me know first if that's something you're interested in and would attend. It's okay if it's not, but I would be interested in doing that if folks are wanting that kind of a thing. All right, so Unit 3, we worked on caudillos, we worked on the conservative liberal struggles of the mid-19th century, in which the Catholic Church was on the conservative side. Liberals were generally anti-clerical, meaning that they weren't anti-religious. They didn't want to stamp out the church. Many of them went to Mass, but instead they wanted to revoke the church's political, social, and economic power. So they wanted the church to be a religious figure in society, but not a political or economic one, because the church had a ton of economic power. It owned land and resources. It was the bank before there were really banks available. The church wielded a lot of political power as well. Those were things that liberals across the region wanted to end. They wanted to end those colonial era legacies of institutions with this kind of power. They did the same thing with the military and with the fuero, as it was called. The fuero was essentially an exemption from being prosecuted for certain crimes just by virtue of being belonging to the military, or being a cleric, being a priest, and there were a number of others. So those were things that liberals targeted as we studied. We had some good questions about why caudillos came to power, and we also talked a bit about scientific racism. And that is an interesting question because some of you pointed out we wouldn't have thought that this was necessarily an issue in Latin America, being such a diverse place. But there were a lot of Latin American elites who wanted to claim whiteness, who wanted to claim a heritage with Europe, and through that heritage, all of the modernization, progress, industrial capitalism that would enrich their nations, make their nations look like they were, on par with European industry and European politics, and American as well by the late 19th century, 1800s. And so they bought into this idea that people of mixed race were somehow inferior, that people of indigenous or African heritage were inferior and incapable of doing the kinds of things that would better the nation. And so there were some different solutions to that we saw, and I should have put solutions in quotation marks. Some of those included whitening the nation, inviting European immigration. That was something that happened in the Southern Cone countries, particularly in Argentina, a little bit in Brazil, although Brazil is always sort of a different story, a bit more complicated, and Chile has a heritage of that as well. So the questions we're going to be looking at as we go into Unit 4 are how did Latin American nations kind of get out from underneath neo-colonialism. That's a term I didn't say yet, but that's what we were studying as well in Unit 3 when we were talking about caudillo politics, the struggles of nation building. A lot of European businesses were able to gain footholds as they worked to modernize Latin American nations by building railroads and telegraphs and things like that. So the problem with that neo-colonial system is that much of the wealth went to foreigners. It went to businessmen from Europe and the United States. It went to bankers. It went to elites in the Latin American nations, and it did not go to campesinos or rural workers. It did not go to laborers in the new factories or on the railroads. It didn't go to indigenous people who were often dispossessed of their lands in this whole process, their lands and their resources. So they were struggling to hang on to their cultures and livelihoods against all of these odds. So by the 20th century, we start to see the call of Mexico for the Mexicans, Guatemala for the Guatemalans, Bolivia for the Bolivians, and so on and so on and so on, as people pushed back. Often there was a multi-class alliance in this pushback. Folks in the middle class who were educated often wanted a space in the political system that was not given to them under the neo-colonial regime. Of course, peasants and indigenous people wanted to reclaim lands that had been stolen from them. They wanted to reclaim a means of earning a livelihood and having some wealth and being able to live their lives, among many, many other things. Of course, this is just a big overview. But that's one of the through lines, I think, between Unit 3 and Unit 4. So in Unit 4, the big part of the guiding question is the term self-determination. Right? So how did nationalism and social revolution, how did those things contribute to self-determination? And so when I say self-determination, I'm talking about that Mexico for the Mexicans. How did these nations try to get back some of the wealth, some of the power from foreigners and from the elites in their society? So that's what you should be looking at as we get into Unit 4. I hope that you're doing well. Again, and please let me know whenever you have questions, could use any help, and I'll talk to you soon.